This is our third session already. We started a month ago, and we started with taking a look at the historical background. What was the situation in Assisi at the beginning of the 13th century? And it was a change of society. We took a look at that to try to understand better what happened then with people like Francis and Clare and others. 2 weeks ago, I focused on the foundational experience with Francis encountering the people with leprosy and having a big experience of compassion that actually changed his life. But what he did not know at the time is that it would also change other people's life. And unexpectedly, he was getting some companions, and they developed a way of life together, some male companions. But then at some point, and this is what we're going to focus on today, well, a woman came into the picture, and then more women came into the picture. And that, of course, was quite an important input and influence on the developing movement with Francis. But with that said, I would like to read a little paragraph from a book that I really like a lot. It's called A People's History of the United States. And it was written by a man called Howard Zinn, who died at a very old age a few years ago. His book is like a Bible of US history for me. I think it has 15 or 16 edition. But this is a paragraph that struck me as soon as I read it, probably 25 years ago. And that is exactly what I'm trying to do in these classes that we have. This is what he wrote at the beginning of his book. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I am supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past fugitive moments of compassion, rather than in its solid centuries of warfare. Of course, you may think that this paragraph is pretty much timely, and I'm afraid it is, but it's just to repeat and illustrate why I am doing and teaching Franciscan history. It is because in what has happened in Central Italy 800 years ago, I find deep inspiration, actually things that have changed and continue to nurture my personal life and social life. And I like to read that paragraph also because I would like to say or to repeat that when we look at the beginning of the Franciscan movement, um, we should be careful not to project anything from the present, and in particular, not to project um, what we know of the Franciscan family nowadays, because things have changed. I would say, let's try not to picture Francis and his early companions the way we look at current Franciscan friars. It's the same family, but there a lot of stuff has changed. And they didn't look like the friars minor look today. I'm not going to go into explanation. That would be another course on the history of the development of the Franciscan family and orders throughout all those centuries. I'm just caution you that they were try to understand and try to imagine them from what we know of the way they were living. They were a bunch of guys, of lay people, of all kinds of social classes, by the way, which was already original, but they weren't dressed very nicely. They weren't considered as uh, attractive in the society. They became, and for better and for worse, but I'm focusing at the very beginning. They were uh, they were different, and they knew they were different because they wanted to be different in the society of their time. They wanted to do something that would actually make them and others happier than the situation in the society. And we're going to focus on Clare and women today. And so, the same way I said, do not imagine Clare and her sisters, her companions, like you could see nowadays Franciscan religious women, poor Clares. They didn't look like that. They were trying to do also something different in harmony with the group of Francis. We're dealing with two groups, one of men, one of women, um, choosing a way of life that we would call today religious, uh, in community of men, community of women. In 2 weeks, we will also take a look and finally see how the movement, to be perfectly inclusive, did also integrate people who were not in a religious group, but sharing the same values, the same way of life. And that is when it became very dangerous for the status quo in the society. So, what was a woman or the women's status in Assisi at the turn of the 13th century? Uh, in a few words, I would say it's definitely a patriarchal society. What does it mean? It means that public life belongs to men. Men rule. Men have all the offices, all the functions. The women's domain is at home. Although I must say, tongue in cheek, that if the women at home have no legal power, they govern. If the men rule, the women govern in the house. That's something that we find even in the, the early Franciscan writings. If you don't get very clearly the distinction that in between the men are ruling and the women actually govern, I would refer to a beautiful scene of a film that you may have seen, and if not, I would encourage you to watch it. It's My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And it's the episode when the girl, the daughter, is crying on the shoulder of the mother because the father doesn't agree with the fact that she fell in love with someone, a man who's not Greek. There are so many nice Greek men, and she should marry a Greek man. And she really cries, and the mother says something that is really expressing what I'm mentioning, to say that the women actually have a place. She says to the daughter, you know, the man is the head of the, the household, but the woman is the neck, and the neck is what makes the head turn. And I think we have something there in the combination in the culture of that time of between public men ruling and private women governing. However, I must also say that the knowledge and the letters are, with some rare exceptions, in the hands of men, which means that most documents that we have about women are written by men, for better or for worse. In the Franciscan movement situation or history, we are lucky that not only Clare has written documents, but moreover that some were preserved. I think there were more writings than what we have, but at least we have a few. It's not always the case. In the Middle Ages, there are so many women we know only from man's writings. And here we reach an issue also, that the men do not necessarily have a positive vision of women, or that they, in their writings, they can show that they are not very comfortable with women. It can go very, I would say, crudely, considering that the women are weak. Of course, women don't say that. It's the men that say that the women are weak. The men justify what they say in saying that the women need the help and the protection of strong men. I'm saying that because it's not only the background of the society where Francis and Clare live, but it has been an impact on Clare's life as a woman. There are documents written by men that can be very crude in saying, for instance, for a woman in Latin, because it's at that time they write in Latin, maritum vel murum. A woman needs a husband or a wall, the wall being the wall of a monastery. Well, in the 13th century, and Clare has actually opened some ways, we see in that communal age when the business is developing, trading is developing, we see women becoming more heart, more visible, more part of the public life. And sometimes sometimes we will eventually see women owning their own business. And there is a rise in the 13th century in the number of unmarried women who are not necessarily in a monastery. So things are changing, and I do think that Clare has been part of that change. But I would say toward the end of the 13th century, a Franciscan preacher made some comments like this one, and I'm not creating it, I'm just translating from the Latin, that a woman working outside the house is like a hen that has flown the coop. That's the background. And so who is Clare that shows up in that background? Well, she is part of a noble family, which means that in Assisi, she is part of the older population of Assisi, the landowners that live in the upper part of the city around the new cathedral. What we know is that we know the name of the father, but he never shows up in any document. So was he dead? What happened? We don't know. The one who's running the family is an uncle called Monaldo, and who's far from being a happy camper, really. But that tells you that if a man is the head of the household, when the man in that household disappeared, another collateral man will take charge. Clare is the oldest of three women, three daughters, and the mother, a widow, probably, seems to have had a big influence on her daughters. Her name, it's interesting, was Ortolana, which means in Italian, a gardener, woman gardener. And Clare will find her way, inspired first by her mother, as having some spiritual depth that is expressed in charitable actions, generosity. And when Clare started her community in the movement with Francis, very quickly a sister will follow her, and then the second sister will follow her, and eventually the mother will follow her. And so the four women of the family, probably with the infuriating the male of the family, were part of the Franciscan movement and the women's part of the movement. Clare and Francis were not supposed to meet, being from the two different upper and lower classes of the city in competition for power and for wealth. But what happened, and it's interesting to see, everything is a human relationship. One of the cousins of Clare, his name was Rufino, a noble man, had joined Francis outside of Assisi, but would come back to Assisi and visit the family. So that was a possibility for Clare to know what was going on there outside of Assisi. It seems also, and I like to say that, because some documents said that Clare went after Francis. It looks more like it's the opposite. Probably Francis would listen to Rufino talking of his cousin, and he was interested in Clare. And very quickly they developed some secret meeting plotting something that was not supposed to happen and would probably never have happened without, and we have to acknowledge that, the blessing and the complicity of the Bishop of Assisi, that had the intelligence to see that that was something actually serious, what they were starting. And so Clare was able, through a whole scenario, to leave Assisi and um, uh, leave Assisi during the night and join the, let me see if this would happen better. Do you have a better view like this? Because I see some reaction. Okay, we see about everyone like that. Or shall I go back to what it was? No? You're okay like this? Okay. So Clare joined, and very quickly they settle. Let me try to show you a picture here. Sharing screen. This picture is the oldest picture that we have, and it's of course not a portrait of Clare. It's more like an icon. It's a piece of art, but it was made probably a couple of decades after Clare died, and it has the major episode of Clare's life around the central figure. So you see at the bottom here, the bishop giving the signal, and then Clare join Francis and the brothers. And this is actually what for me is interesting. You see Francis has brothers, has companions, but so does Clare. She didn't join alone. There was already a whole project that had started. Of course, afterwards, they focus on the saints, but I think that medallion here is very important to see. From the beginning, we have a group of several men and several women. Here is a little view of Assisi that I like to put back, especially for those of you who have never been there. This is actually what the people in the leper colony would see, not with the big new construction, but basically from outside. This gives you an idea of the beauty of the countryside there. And this is the place where Clare will settle. So this is, now you can understand, there was no question that Clare and her companions would then live with Francis and his companions the same way of life. Yes, the same way of life in terms of value, but again, the men are more public and itinerant, and the women have a house. It did not exactly look like that 800 years ago, but this is the sacred place where Clare and the first ladies, women, actually started living the same way of life and together. Now, it was not easy. They had the support of the Bishop of Assisi, but above the bishop, there is the papacy. And this kind of things, new things are suspicious. especially when women take their life into their hands. And that is exactly what will happen with Clare. As long as Francis will be alive, Francis will be, um, I would say, the protector. As long as the bishop was in agreement and the Pope had given his verbal agreement as well, it was okay. But the problem was that other group of women in the area and as far as Tuscany were hearing what Clare and the companions were doing, which was not the only alternative to married life, the monastic life, a monastery. They were not living that. They were living just simply a life of community, of sisters, uh, taking care of each other, but also taking care of other people. And I will come back to that in a little moment. Um, Clare had the help of Francis to maintain that life in the place that is called San Damiano. But when Francis died, after he died, she lost that protection, and she definitely had to take a stand and stand her own ground. And she did. This is where we have a document that says that, document written by Clare, document written by some brother, showing how Clare resisted. One of the major episode is that 2 years after Francis died, the Pope came to Assisi, and as a cardinal, Ugolino, he had known Francis and he had known Clare. He had even spent an Easter retreat in San Damiano. And then he comes to Assisi to canonize Francis, making Francis a saint. And then he comes and visits Clare in San Damiano and said, well, you know, now that Francis is over, you better join the rest of the group that I have, the group of women, communities of women that I have organized, and follow the regulations that I have written for her. And Clare said, well, there is a major issue there, is that like Francis and the brothers, we live the gospel in poverty, in the sense that we don't have properties that will bring us our livelihood. We work for that, and you don't have that in your regulations. And the Pope said, well, my dear sister, I am the Pope. I can actually give you permission and not to follow that. And Clare, that I can imagine with a big smile, said, well, I'm sorry, Your Holiness, but my promise was to God. And I don't think that you can absolve me from that kind of promise. That must have been tough on the Pope, because he never came back to Assisi after that. So she was really strong. And like a decade later, she's in contact by letters with a princess in Prague called Agnes. She's the daughter of the king. And she has heard of Clare and the community in Assisi, and she wants to do exactly the same thing in Prague. And she did. She found a place outside of the city and built something totally similar, and had the documents that copies of the document that Clare had, but she got in trouble with the Pope. And it's like an interesting thing. We have documents of Clare encouraging Agnes to also stand her ground. And we have that beautiful paragraph in which, without mentioning the Pope, but in which Clare writes to Agnes, you know what you want to live and what you have been called to live and what you have promised to live. Do it. Keep doing it. And if anybody would actually advise you something else, although you must respect him, and there is no confusion, it's a him, don't do it. Wow. That would be called civil disobedience. Don't do it. And she insists in saying, after all, we are part of the movement started by Francis. He may be dead, but there is someone that is at the head of the movement, and his name is Brother Elias. So refer to him. And between the lines saying, and let him handle the Pope. So very strong and unusual or unheard of. And it will go farther because eventually Clare will write more documents, and even a document that described their way of life. And it will be the first time that a woman write the document for the community. Otherwise, women always receive a document written by men and are supposed to go with that. Clare is definitely a leader and a model of leadership as a woman. And I have no problem saying that, because that's exactly what at the end of a class that I gave on the life of Clare, a student that is actually as a medical doctor in the Navy, said that she will always take Clare as a model of leadership with her, knowing that she's joining, I'm quoting her, she's joining a man's world. So Clare was really a powerful leader, but the characteristics of her leadership, it's very important. It's not a top-down leadership. She describes her leadership and the leadership of anyone who will succeed her leading the community in San Damiano as building the consensus. Consensus, which means not a majority, but so that eventually they all agree to do something together. We have a document that proves that. In 1238, that's about 12 years after Francis died, some people gave the sister a piece of land. They didn't want it. So they wanted to sell it and then give the product, the money of the sale for the poor. So we have what we would call today a power of attorney to a lawyer to negotiate the sale. By the way, the people who purchased that piece of land was the chapter of the clergy, the canons at the cathedral. But why do I mention that power of attorney? Because usually, normally, it would be signed by the head of the community. In this case, it has been signed by every members of the community, all of them. And that's how we have all their names, and that's how we know that they were at that time 50. There were 50 members in that community. So Clare is building consensus, and she shows it. She also shows that as a woman, she governs as a nurturing mother. And that is very important because she had to accept the traditional title of abbess of a community of women. And she didn't like it because the abbess in a monastic community is the queen. And that's not what she wanted to be. She wanted to be a sister. But she probably realized that the word abbess actually literally means mother. And so what she did, I like to say that, she took the title and redefined the job description, not as the queen of the community, but as the nurturing mother of the community. And she always remains the sister among her sisters. And she also says that that position is actually a charge. It's a charge of service. And she begs the sister to make the charge lighter in being in good relationship, what they call obedience, listening to each other. And the more they would be listening to each other out of love, the lighter the charge of the mother would be. Clare made the Franciscan movement definitely more inclusive, more complete. And she introduced a new model for women at the time, a new way, not either marriage or monastic life, a new kind of community in relationship as sisters and part of a movement with brothers, with men. That was not easy to develop because, as I was saying before, men, and particularly men in charge, and particularly in the ecclesiastic world, do not really trust women. I remember one day I was in a community in Rome, and we were talking of really being hospitable and welcome mothers, sisters, of members of the community at a table for a meal. And a good holy old friar, I could not believe what he said. He was really perturbed with that proposal and sort of exploded and saying, I don't know what we can do with women outside of a confessional. That shocked me. I think it was very rude. And a little later, I was talking to a very good friend of mine who is a poor sister, a poor Clare sister. And she's at the telephone, and she started laughing and saying, wow, he definitely lacks imagination. So, but I need to say even more. In San Damiano, there is more than a new community of women in relationship among themselves and with the outside world. There is more there. And that explains why they settled in San Damiano. Although I never saw any documents saying it explicitly, but I do think that given what was happening there, it was the place of choice. That little church with a hospice, because that's what it was, a hospitium, a place of hospitality outside of Assisi. That little church has been built a couple of centuries before and was dedicated to San Damiano. Well, actually, Damien, has a twin brother, Cosmas. They're old Greek saints. They were twin brothers who were healers. And so that place was dedicated to San Damiano. They probably dropped Cosmas to make it short, because it was a healing place. There was a hospitium, there was a good spring of water, and Clare and her sisters took over the service there. It was a place of hospitality, a place of shelter, a place of healing. And in the writings of Clare, she talks of the sisters who serve outside the building of the community. That was just next door. They didn't have to travel, but they were prodiging hospitality. And here I think it's important for you to know that in the Romance languages coming from the Latin, hospes, the noun, means in English not only host, but also guest. The same word is used for both sides of the relationship that is at the center of hospitality. We're back to Francis's experience of misericordia, of compassion with the people with leprosy. It's not doing good deeds for, it's actually taking care of in both ways. It's the with. So we are sometimes hosts and sometimes guests. And host and guest are in Latin one word and the component of hospitium, hospitality. I have an example, a very recent example in my own life. This past summer, my wife in Belgium became very sick, terminally sick. And she was taken in hospice.
Not your wife, your mother.
Oh, not my wife, I'm sorry. My mother. My wife just came to tell me that it was not she. No, it wasn't. Thank God it wasn't. So why do I say that? Well, my mother with terminal cancer was put in hospice care. That's the end. And she was surrounded by nurses who were really, really nurturing, taking wonderful care of her. I know that because I was able, thanks to them, to remain daily in touch with her like we are now, through Zoom or WhatsApp or Skype or anything using the internet. she was being taken care of wonderfully. However, they, the nurses, never missed an opportunity to tell me how they loved my mother, saying, she is a ray of sun here. And my mother would tell me, I don't know what it is, but they keep coming one after the other, spend some time with me, and we chit chat. And I said, well, I think they like to come and spend some time with you. And then she said something beautiful. She said, well, they have a very tough job, hard work. So I'm trying to make it a little lighter for them. I think that explains hospitality. And I also know from documents that Clare was spending a lot of time in San Damiano doing that. Whether it was with sisters who were companions who were sick, or some brothers who were sick, or simply people who were sick and would come to San Damiano. It may have been quite an hospice, to use the modern word for that. And so it is clear that besides being a leader, Clare also was quite a healer and a nurse. And it is not until quite recently in history that a woman could be called a medical doctor. But in modern times, I think Clare would have called a medical doctor. It is clear that she had a gift and she had knowledge and she was doing things that actually sometimes people did not understand how she was doing it. And they just have to say, well, she was praying, and then something happened. I think there was more, but I'm just saying that all that place of San Damiano is something really amazing, and it is important to maintain the memory of that, because what has happened can happen again. We know that with bad stuff, it's also true with good stuff. In 2 weeks, we will turn to then the expansion of the movement with lay people. And I will start with an episode that connects very directly to hospice and hospitality, and with the episode how Francis dying got hospice care. Not from Clare in San Damiano, where he was in the plane at the Porciuncola, a lay woman came. But I'll tell you that story the next time in 2 weeks when we meet, and more stories about what it means to be part of the movement, not as religious men or religious women, but as simply as human being. So at this point, I don't know if you have any question. I don't see anything in the chat. What I can do is actually, if I could unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Okay, so I see something written. Did Clare and Francis observe Catholic practices, holidays, worship of saints, etc.? Sure they did. They did, because It was part of the life of people in Europe, unless they would have been Jewish, but they were Christian, and in Europe, Western Europe, member of the Roman Catholic Church. So yes, they observe the practices. There would be a lot to say about that, actually, more than the practices. They, and I think next in 2 weeks I will say a word of that. Um, it was not just going to mass. It was not just going to church. Actually, they were back to the memory of Jesus and what he did and tried to celebrate that. And that is fascinating because it's they went out of the culture of the time in focusing like that. But they were, yes, you must also realize that at the time of Francis and Clare, not only the, they are all part of the church, they're all baptized and they all follow practices. Um, but in the case of the Franciscan movement, they really used those practices to rhythm their life. And it was not just things that they had to do, but they focused on on the deep meaning of some practices and practiced it that way, so that um, it was not just following the obligations out of fear of hell, because the fear of hell was all over the place and well maintained by the clergy. But I don't see any fear of hell in the Franciscan movement, which is a very good sign. Other things popped in. When you say it was an inclusive movement, does that mean it included all social classes? How is inclusivity defined in this case? Yes, absolutely. Um, the inclusivity or the inclusiveness is a little bit different in the case of the men and the women. The women, Clare and her first companions were predominantly people of the family and cousins and friends of the Upper Assisi, which means they were all noble ladies. That's why actually even Francis was calling them not my sisters, but my ladies. However, all those ladies had servants. And in the context of the time, the servant is actually a friend, a confidant. And when Clare and other women moved outside of Assisi to settle then in San Damiano, they were ladies and their servants. How did it become inclusive? Is that they became all sisters. No more lady and servant. So you can take it, for them, they were all sisters, serving each other. And from the outside, if people wanted to address them as ladies, even those who used to be servants were ladies then. So that is how the inclusiveness worked among the women. Among the men, the variety was even much more, because very clearly, like the first dozen of men that joined Francis, some were from the Upper Assisi. Rufino, cousin of Clare, was noble. Some were laborers. Some were beggars. We have some indication of a huge variety of social origin and funny stories also. because, there was one, for all of them, there was one condition to join, main condition, an economic condition, coming with nothing, coming with no properties, which means that it was open. If you didn't have anything to leave, you're okay, you're ready. And if you had something to leave, well, then, leave it. And according to the gospel, leave it to the benefits of those in need. But then we have some funny stories sometimes. Here comes that man that was actually poor, but in his family, they were 4 brothers, and all they had and they owned in common was a cow. So how could he sell a quarter of a cow? And then Francis said, well, forget it. Just leave the cow with your brothers. That's fine. But the variety among the men also includes the fact that some clerics, some priests joined. And they never stopped to be priests, but they stopped having a clerical status of priest. They stopped having what that was called at the time the sacerdotal or priestly benefit. The priest was running a church, but never worked. Some people were working a piece of land that belonged to the church, and they were providing. So basically, the priests that joined became brothers among other brothers, and without any benefit. So I think that that's something that we can look at even more, but I hope that explains a little bit. Is there any, you didn't mention the imposition of cloister on the community. Can you speak to that and how it influenced the community ability to provide hospitality? That came after Clare. Clare resisted. That's part of her resistance. The real enclosure came after she died. And how did the powers that be, even the church, made it happen? They moved the community from San Damiano to a brand new monastery built for them in Assisi. But of course, the monastery was built according to what the papacy wanted for now what we would call the nuns. If you go to Assisi and you take a look at that monastery that still exists, you will see that there are no windows looking outside. Everything is inside. There is a door that is always closed. So they were never able to do that while Clare was alive. But after that, yes, it happens. And that is why I tell you, and I know poor Clares that are still today struggling how to go back to San Damiano. But that's why poor Clares nowadays are different from the poor sister of Clare and in San Damiano. So is there any indication that Clare was familiar with use of herbs? Of course she was. They had a garden with those things. They have a garden of herbs. That was part actually of the women's field. The women's field. They knew the herbs. They knew how to cook, but they also knew how to cook remedies. Do you think that one attraction women had to join Clare was to escape male domination in their lives? It may have been something, but I think there was something more positive. It was not just to escape the male domination, but to have actually the possibility to realize their life as women and in brotherly, sisterly relationship with men, because that's exactly what was happening at the beginning. And there was a small group, 3, 4 brothers living next to San Damiano, so that if the women needed something, they would be there. When Clare died, there were 3 companions, surviving companions of Francis, at her bed. So don't give me the stuff about the cloister and the enclosure. They were there because they were still living the relationship of brothers and sisters, caring for each other. 2 years before Francis died, he spent a couple of months at San Damiano, sick. And who was caring for him? Clare and her sisters. And that's where, when he composed his famous Lauda di Dio, Canticle of the Creatures, and he also composed a song of gratitude for the sisters in Umbrian. That was lost until 30, 40 years ago, incidentally rediscovered. The parchment on which it had been written had been used to cover a book. And taking that cover from the book, all of a sudden that text reappeared. And we know it's the text because Brother Leo, companion of Francis, that wrote everything he could about Francis and then Clare, had mentioned that he composed that song and actually described the content of the song. So we could see, yes, this Umbrian song, it is the one that Leo was writing about. And how did the early Franciscans view their relationship to broader penitential movement? Probably very well, because basically what happens, and we'll talk of that in 2 weeks, little by little, the people who wanted to join the penitential movement joined the Franciscan movement. So by the end of the 13th century, when the Pope finally has legal documents recognizing what then will be called the Third Franciscan Order, it's actually the brothers and sisters of the Order of Penance that are part of the Franciscan movement. The only, not the only, but dramatically, when you put the brothers into one institution, an order, and then the women, an order, and then the laity, an order, it's divisive. Mm-hmm. So you have to go backwards to rebuild the movement before the separation into different orders. It was like that. It can be like that. It all depends on the persons. So did I think yeah, I'm at the end of the list. And I went over the time. I'm sorry, I abused your patience.
No, you didn't. What about that picture with Clare and Francis?
Okay, that as a dessert, I will offer you one more picture. San Damiano, inside the church, as it is today, but you can see that it was much smaller at that time. This is the famous crucifix I mentioned 2 weeks ago. And this is what Athena would like me to show. This is the colorful version. The original version was simply a drawing without colors. This picture shows actually Francis on the left with a companion, Clare on the right with a companion, and they have over the shoulders what we call a haversack. A haversack. I still saw that in the late 60s in Italy, some brothers on the road. It's something that you throw over your shoulders and you can stuff stuff in the front, in the back, and that it's the ancestor of the backpack. But what it shows here is that they're holding hands, they have companions, and in the background you see the church, but the wall is broken. The wall is broken. And then there is more in that. If you go in the upper here, on the upper right corner, you have people at the table. And who are they? Francis on the left and companion, and Clare on the right and companion. They are eating together. And we have some documents saying that things like that happened, and it was very cheerful. And to make sure that it was something good, here in the sky, you have a character that is smiling, and this is supposed to be God. God sees the picture and smiles. Now, that picture, I saw the original. It's the size of a credit card. And it's on the title page of A Life of Clare, written in Old Dutch in the early 1500, at the time where the Reformation is coming. And I found it absolutely amazing that, because at that time, it was the poor Clares in enclosure. So somebody painted that or drew it first, and then in another book painted it after reading the life of Clare and realizing that the picture was at the time very different from what it was in 1500. And if you want one more picture, since it's there, a modern picture, a picture that is 2 years old, it's this.
Yeah.
Clare and Francis in conversation on a bench on St. Bonaventure University campus. Francis has the wolf and Clare has her cat, because in the documents we know that Clare had a cat that was playing with her yarn when she was working. And as you can see, this is the young Clare in all her garment of noble lady. Some have wondered why there is so much room between the two of them. Is that the modern version of the enclosure, of the separation? Not at all. The idea came from the students I worked on this with and said, we should have room for us to sit with them. And that's why there is that room. If you ever go to St. Bonaventure University, make sure that you sit there for a while, even if it rains. Okay, I stop the share, and I will see you again in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, don't hesitate to write to me with comments, with question. If you need more material to read, I will be very happy to provide. Okay?
Very good.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.